Thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss how people living with cancer can best navigate the COVID-19 environment. My name is Jamie Troyle Goldfarb. I am a stage 4 melanoma survivor and patient advocate. And much more importantly, with me today is Dr. Stephanie Goff, who's an associate research physician at the surgical branch at the National Cancer Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Goff.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for inviting me to participate. I'm a surgical oncologist and I work with patients who have cancer. I also study tumor immunology. So while I am not a virologist or an epidemiologist or a public health specialist, I hope that I can answer some of your questions about how patients who have or had cancer can help navigate the COVID-19 environment.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. So I'll get right to some of our important questions. First question for you. What precautions should people who have or have had cancer take to protect ourselves from COVID-19?
Well, that's actually one of the simplest questions. And the answer is the same thing that everyone else should be doing. So we've talked a lot about for the last year, making sure to do things to keep yourself safe, staying away from crowded situations, washing your hands, wearing a mask. The most important thing we think right now in the scientific community is getting a vaccine. So anyone over the age of 12 who can get a vaccine should get a vaccine. And that's really the most important way to keep yourself safe.
Dr. Goff, is the COVID-19 vaccine safe for people who have had or have cancer?
Well, Jamie, the answer is absolutely yes. But what's important to remember is that people who are in the middle of a cancer treatment need to discuss that with their doctors. I obviously can't know the details of everybody's treatment, but what I can say is that the majority of people who are survivors like yourself or who have finished their treatments can certainly take the vaccine without trouble. The only instances in which we would ask people to wait would be if they've just gotten an intense chemotherapy, something that has lowered their immune system, because we want to make sure that the cells that need to be there for that vaccine to work are there and ready to generate the sort of responses that will protect people from COVID.
So, Dr. Goff, it sounds to me like potentially the vaccine might not be effective for people who do not have the proper immune response for the vaccine to take effect. However, is there anything in the vaccine that we know of that could negatively affect somebody's cancer treatment?
Well, Jamie, what I can tell you is that what we know, there should not be anything in any of the 3 vaccines to date that the FDA has allowed for emergency use to combat COVID-19. That's the Moderna, the Pfizer, or the Johnson & Johnson. Now, what I will tell you is that the studies that were used to develop those did not necessarily include patients with cancer. And so we are now currently here at the NCI studying a long-term history of patients who have cancer, who have developed COVID-19, as well as studying COVID-19 vaccination in patients with cancer. And those are resources that you can find not only through Combat COVID, but through cancer.gov.
Is there anything about the vaccine that could affect the diagnosis of cancer?
Well, very specifically, and I'm in this age group too, women who are getting mammograms. Because the vaccine is given in the arm, it can sometimes activate the lymph nodes that live in your armpit or your axilla. And sometimes those can show up as what we would call a false positive when you get a mammogram. So I would say most primary care physicians would either recommend that you wait 5 to 6 weeks after getting a vaccine to get your mammogram, or get your mammogram before your first vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. We've been hearing a lot about monoclonal antibodies as a treatment for COVID-19. Are people who have had or have cancer eligible for treatment with monoclonal antibodies?
There's nothing in the description of the monoclonal antibodies that have been approved for use that would suggest that patients who have or had cancer shouldn't be able to take them. But again, that's a very personal decision. It depends on what stage of treatment someone is in and whether that might interfere with the drugs that they're currently taking. It's very important if you're thinking about using something like the monoclonal antibodies, and perhaps your primary care doctor who's helping deliver those for you needs to be in contact with your oncologist.
That being said, are there any current treatments that are considered best or safest for people living with cancer?
Well, Jamie, I wish I could answer that question for you. But what I will tell you is that science is an iterative process. By that, I mean, we do the best we can until we learn something new and then we change things. It's like that Maya Angelou quote. Do the best you can until you know better. And then once you know better, do better. And so I can't even tell you which of the treatments are better for people who don't have cancer. I would tell you that we're learning more and more every day. And as we get further along, as we're seeing people who have had COVID-19 survive, perhaps are dealing with long-term side effects, we'll know more about what the different kinds of treatments are able to do. It's not something we can rush. And so in any particular community, the group of people who have been treating patients with COVID-19 are going to know what has been working best in their hands. It's not perfect, but it's what we have until we can gather all the data and come up with better answers, better solutions.
And one of the best ways for us to come up with these better answers and better solutions for treatments for COVID-19 for everyone, including people living with cancer, is through medical research. We know clinical trials to treat cancer are effective for people living with cancer. Are people living with cancer eligible for clinical trials around the treatment of COVID-19?
Absolutely. There are studies being done at the NCI and probably at centers across the country, but I can only speak to the ones here at the NCI, where we're trying to do an absolutely in-depth look at how we can help patients with cancer dealing with COVID-19. Now, part of that is just watching a natural history of what happens in those patients, whether they're vaccinated or not, whether they get the disease or they don't. But another part of it is actively seeking out patients who have cancer to get vaccinated so that we can study the effects of those vaccines on their blood levels, on their protection, on their immunity. You know, we're in the process of learning every day. News has just come out within the last week that people who have gotten the vaccines seem to have immunity that's lasted over a year. And so it may be that these levels of protection that we're providing are just going to get stronger and stronger, but the science has to keep going so that we can understand all of that a little bit better.
Is there anything in particular, Dr. Goff, that you would like people living with cancer to know about navigating the COVID-19 environment?
Well, you know, I think what's really important for patients with cancer and anyone really is to recognize that this has been a tremendous upheaval of our society for the last year, and not only ours, but across the world. It's been a time of isolation. It's been a time of confusion, and a lot of people need a lot more emotional support than they're used to asking for. And for patients with cancer, sometimes they have access to resources that they don't always use, whether that's physicians, nurses, support groups. I will say, and I hope that this is a good outcome of this, is that because so many people have had to deal with the consequences of isolation, perhaps we're going to become a slightly more empathetic nation, because we know what it feels like to be scared to go out, to be worried that you're going to catch something, a fear that that people with cancer live with every day. And so I would say, in particular, patients with cancer always know their bodies well. Continue to listen to that, continue to hone in on that, but don't be afraid to ask for help across the board, for people with cancer, for people who are caregivers for people with cancer, for people who are taking care of people with cancer like me. There, physicians and nurses, everyone across this country needs to reach out for emotional support. We don't want the next pandemic to be an even sadder one.
Yes, thank you for that important point. Cancer already can be such an emotional roller coaster with so many additional stressors to add on top. Can be a difficult time for us, for sure. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Goff. Your information is invaluable for people living with cancer, our caregivers, and really anyone. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to help explain to us how to navigate the COVID-19 environment.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for asking me to participate. There are federal government resources all across the country to help people coping not only with cancer, but with COVID. And unfortunately, for those patients who might have both. So, please take advantage of the resources available to you. And I think Jamie's going to tell you more about those right now.
For more information about how people living with cancer and their families can best navigate COVID-19, please visit combatcovid.hhs.gov. Thank you.